The morning opened with a sky veiled in pale gold, the kind of light that lingered like a whispered promise of change, even when the earth below remained bound by duty and unspoken sorrow. Annie pressed her palm against the window, her breath clouding the glass as she watched the Nebraska prairies stretch endlessly, wide and unforgiving. Dust swirled in the distance, little spirals of earth that danced as if mocking her stillness. She had long accepted her role, the plain sister, the one whose hands bore the rough truth of toil, whose skin carried the mark of sun and wind, whose presence was always a backdrop to someone else's brilliance. But that morning was different. That morning she heard the crack in her father's voice, the tremor behind her mother's silence, and her sister Evelyn's sobs, soft, beautiful, and calculated, filling the air like the last act of a play Annie had never wanted to watch. Then came the words that struck like thunder, "Then let Annie go." The world tilted. Time slowed, and in that frozen instant Annie saw her life unravel and knot itself anew. A mail-order bride's journey was meant for Evelyn. The golden-haired beauty men adored, the one courted by smiles and promises. Yet here Annie stood, her fate decided not by love or choice, but by obligation, by her family's hunger for survival and reputation. It was cruel, perhaps, and yet, beneath the sting, a strange seed of possibility stirred. She packed her worn dresses, folded her mother's Bible with careful reverence, and held the peppermint candies given with quiet tenderness, a small sweetness for a journey into the unknown. Each item in her trunk felt like both farewell and armor. The coach rattled into motion days later, carrying her farther from home with each turn of its wheels. The road stretched across vast prairies and into the raw heart of wilderness, where every shadow whispered both danger and destiny. Annie's back ached from the endless jolts, her dress gathered dust no matter how often she brushed it clean, but her spirit, though trembling, refused to break. She listened to the minister beside her speak of the frontier's hardships and opportunities, watched weary travelers clutch their hopes against the wind, and wondered if anyone else knew what it was to be both sacrifice and salvation in the same breath. Her thoughts always circled back to him, the rancher, Jesse Hartland, who had written words meant for Evelyn, but who would find Annie instead. His letters spoke of land carved from silence, of mountains that touched the heavens, of loneliness too heavy to name. What would he see when his eyes met hers? Would he reject her, cast her back toward a family that had already turned away? Or would he, by some miracle, see the truth of her soul beyond her plainness? As Wyoming's rugged peaks rose against the horizon, sharp and solemn like sentinels, Annie felt her heart hammer harder than the wheels grinding against the dirt road. Tomorrow her path would meet Jesse's. Tomorrow the truth she carried like a fragile ember would ignite into something. Acceptance, rejection, or perhaps a chance neither had imagined. She clutched his letters in her pocket, her only bridge to the man who waited, her only comfort in the storm of doubt swirling within. The prairie wind howled against the coach walls, wild and unbroken, and Annie closed her eyes, drawing healing from its strength. Whatever lay ahead, loneliness, hardship, or a love that might yet bloom, she would meet it as she had always met life, steady, honest, unafraid to stand in the shadow and still reach for light. And if this journey stirs something within your own heart, If Annie's quiet courage, her yearning for belonging, awakens a memory or a hope in you, share it with us. Leave a comment. Let your voice be part of this story. A gentle like, a heartfelt subscription. They are not just gestures, but threads that weave us together, carrying warmth and connection like lanterns through the dusk. Support, even the smallest kind, allows stories like these to keep unfolding, offering healing where the world often forgets to. As Annie's story moves forward toward the man waiting with storm-grey eyes and an uncertain heart, let us walk beside her, together, into the tender unknown. The sun sank low behind the mountains, casting the world in hues of rose and fire. Tomorrow would bring Jesse Hartland, the ranch, the truth, and with it, the beginning of something far greater than anyone had planned. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in a haze of dust, the sun dipping low behind the mountains as though the very heavens were holding their breath for what was about to unfold. Annie's fingers tightened on the small trunk balanced beside her, her heart beating a wild rhythm that drowned out the chatter of fellow passengers. She stepped down, her worn boots pressing into Wyoming soil for the first time, and the wind rushed up to greet her, fierce and untamed, tugging at the ribbons of her bonnet as if to test her resolve. The station bustled with strangers, merchants in neat suits, ranchers with dust-streaked faces, women shepherding children. But Annie's eyes sought only one figure. And then she saw him. Tall, broad-shouldered, a man carved by work and weather, his black hat casting a shadow over grey eyes that caught her breath. Jesse Hartland. His presence was steady, commanding, yet tempered with something quieter, like the silence of the land itself. He stepped forward, his gaze scanning her face with confusion, expectation, and something deeper that she could not yet name. Annie's throat tightened, but she summoned the truth, every word trembling on her lips, yet spoken with the quiet strength she had carried all her life. "I'm Annie McAllister, Evelyn's sister. She did not come. My father sent me instead." For a heartbeat, the air between them seemed to freeze. His brow furrowed, the faintest crease of disappointment or disbelief crossing his features. Annie felt heat rise in her cheeks, her plainness laid bare against the beauty he had been promised. Yet she held his gaze, refusing to shrink away. "I told them it was wrong," she said softly. "But I came because I could not let the lie remain. If you wish me gone, I will not blame you." The words nearly tore her in two, yet they were truth, and truth was the only gift she could offer. Jesse studied her with the measured calm of a man accustomed to weighing storms against seasons. Slowly he reached for her trunk, lifting it as though it weighed nothing, and said only, "My wagon's this way." His voice was rough, unyielding, yet not without an undercurrent of reluctant respect. Annie followed, her steps steady even as her heart faltered, the dust of Cheyenne curling around them like a veil. The road carried them away from town, past saloons glowing with lamplight and laughter, past shuttered shops and painted women who watched with painted smiles, until at last the prairie opened wide and silent under a sky strewn with stars. Annie sat beside him on the wagon bench, her shawl pulled close, listening to the creak of wheels and the rhythm of hooves. The silence between them was not empty, but heavy with unspoken questions. "Why did you come?" Jesse asked at last, his eyes fixed on the darkening trail. Annie's answer was quiet but unwavering. "To honor what was promised, but more than that, to give you truth. "I did not come to deceive you." Something shifted in him then, almost imperceptible, like the first thaw after a long winter. He said nothing more, but his hand, rough and scarred, steadied her as she climbed down before his home, a sturdy house of timber and stone that bore the mark of years of hard work. Inside, the rooms were plain, yet clean, everything arranged for function rather than comfort. Annie felt the loneliness in the walls, in the way silence clung like dust. Jessie lit a lantern, its glow softening the shadows, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt the faint stir of belonging. Supper was simple, beef stew and bread, but eaten across from him it became something more. His questions were direct, practical, yet each answer she gave seemed to steady his gaze upon her. Could she cook? Yes. Could she mend, tend, endure? Yes. Could she stand against isolation? Yes. Her life had been nothing but preparation for such things, though no one had ever valued them before. Jessie said little, but the weight of his silence was no longer suspicion. It was consideration, the kind of careful thought a man gives before deciding if the ground before him is worth planting. That night, in the small guest room he offered, Annie lay awake, listening to the restless Wyoming wind, rattling the shutters. Her heart ached with fear of rejection, yet within the ache there was a thread of healing warmth, fragile but alive. For the first time, she dared to imagine that perhaps her worth was not in being Evelyn's shadow, but in being herself. Steady, unadorned, enduring. When dawn broke, she rose and moved through the kitchen with instinctive ease, preparing biscuits, bacon, and strong coffee. The scent filled the house, and when Jessie entered, stamping dust from his boots, he paused as though struck by something he could not name. He sat, he ate, and though his words were few, Annie saw it in his eyes, a spark, faint but undeniable, that spoke of recognition. Perhaps beauty lay not in golden hair or porcelain skin, but in the quiet, healing presence of someone who saw the land, the work, and the man for what they truly were. By the time the sun climbed high, Annie knew with quiet certainty that her life had already begun to change. What awaited her here was not a story borrowed from her sister, nor a future dictated by duty alone, but the unfolding of something real. She felt it in the warmth of the kitchen, in Jessie's measured silence, in the steady hum of the prairie beyond the windows. This was not yet love, but it was the soil where love could grow, rough, imperfect, but alive with possibility. And as the day stretched forward, she carried within her not just fear, but a fragile hope that this man, this life, this land might be the place where she would finally be chosen, not as second best, not as a substitute, but as herself. The mountains loomed in the distance, their snow-crowned peaks whispering of storms and trials to come, yet also of beauty fierce enough to heal. Annie squared her shoulders, ready to meet them. Tomorrow and the days after would test her, but tonight she had given truth, and truth was a seed that no storm could uproot. The morning broke over the ranch with a chorus of sounds Annie had never known so intimately before. The lowing of cattle carried across the fields, the clatter of hooves in the corral, the call of roosters greeting the sun that rose sharp and clear over the snow-streaked mountains. Annie stood at the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, watching Jessie move through the barnyard. His stride was steady, purposeful, every motion speaking of long practice, of a man who had built his world with his own 2 hands. There was no hesitation in him, only the quiet certainty of someone who met each day's demands without complaint. Something in that steadiness soothed her frayed spirit, like water poured over scorched earth. For the first time since leaving home, Annie felt the edges of her heart begin to soften, as though the wild Wyoming wind itself carried healing in its breath. When Jesse returned, stamping mud from his boots and shrugging off the crisp morning air, he found the kitchen transformed. The table was set, biscuits golden in the oven, bacon crisping in the pan, eggs perfectly fried. Annie had worked without thought, her body moving through familiar rhythms, her spirit anchored by the simple act of creating nourishment. Jesse paused in the doorway, his grey eyes fixed on her as though he were seeing not just a woman in his kitchen, but a quiet light filling a space that had long been empty. He sat without a word, and when she placed the plate before him, something flickered in his gaze, a warmth he did not voice but could not hide. They ate mostly in silence, yet it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of 2 souls feeling the edges of one another's presence, testing the ground between them. When he finally spoke, his words were plain, but weighted with meaning. "I don't need a wife for ornament," he said, his voice low and firm. "I need a partner, someone who can weather storms, who won't turn from hard work, who'll stand beside me when the land tests everything we have." Annie met his eyes, her own steady though her heart trembled. "I've known what it is to be overlooked in a crowded room, to labour unseen while others shone. I don't fear the storms of land or sky. What I want is not a place handed to me, but one I've earned. If partnership is what you seek, then I am not afraid." The weight of her words settled between them, reshaping the space. Jesse studied her with the same deliberate care he gave to his land, as though measuring her strength not just in what she said, but in the quiet endurance written in her every movement. Finally, he nodded, the faintest ghost of approval touching his stern features. "We'll see," he murmured, but in his tone there was less doubt and more recognition. Later that day, Jesse led her across the ranch, his stride long, his voice clipped but not unkind as he showed her the fences, the corrals, the fields stretching into the distance. Every post, every building bore the imprint of his labour, scarred hands shaping wood and stone into shelter against a harsh world. 200 acres, he said simply. Built it after the war. Nothing here was given. It was all carved out of the earth. Annie felt the vastness press against her chest, both daunting and strangely freeing. Here, surrounded by silence and sky, she was not Evelyn's shadow. She was simply herself, and the land seemed to welcome that truth. As the afternoon waned, a rider appeared on the horizon, dust trailing behind him like a banner. Jonah Cooper, young and easy in manner, greeted Annie with unguarded admiration, his smile warm enough to stir a blush to her cheeks. Jesse's grey eyes hardened almost imperceptibly as he watched Jonah linger too long in conversation, his compliments flowing as freely as the wind. Annie, unaccustomed to being noticed by men, felt both awkward and strangely alive beneath Jonah's gaze. Yet when Jesse's voice cut in, low and firm, directing Jonah back to his work, it carried not just authority, but a subtle claim she dared not yet name. That evening, as twilight bled gold across the sky, Annie moved through the house with practiced ease. She aired the rooms, set beans to soak, kneaded dough for bread. The house began to shed its bachelor's stillness, becoming warm, alive, touched with her quiet presence. Jessie returned at sunset to find her in the garden, sleeves rolled, hands deep in the soil, as she coaxed neglected plants back to life. He took the bucket from her without a word, their fingers brushing for a fleeting instant, and together they watered the fragile green shoots. The silence between them then was not heavy, but companionable, like two rivers running side by side. Over supper, Jonah's laughter filled the house, his stories drawing smiles even from Annie, though Jessie grew quieter, his gaze sharp as it moved between them. When Jonah finally left, tipping his hat with a grin that lingered on Annie longer than courtesy required, Jessie closed the door and stood in silence. Annie washed the dishes, her hands steady though her heart beat faster. At last Jessie spoke, his voice roughened by something deeper than fatigue. "He's a good man," he said slowly. "Young, eager. He'd caught you proper if I—" He trailed off, the words unfinished, but hanging heavy. Annie's hands stilled in the water. "Is that what you've decided?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jessie's jaw tightened, his grey eyes shadowed. "I haven't decided anything. Except—" His gaze swept the room, lingered on her, softened despite himself. "Except the house already feels different with you in it. Alive." Annie felt the words sink into her heart like rain into parched soil, tentative yet life-giving. She did not answer, not with words, but with the quiet steadiness of her presence, letting silence carry what her trembling lips could not. That night, as she lay in the narrow guest bed, the sound of coyotes drifting on the wind, she touched the memory of his voice, of the way his eyes had softened, and let herself believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she was not here as a shadow, but as herself. The mountains loomed beyond the horizon, their peaks hidden by night, promising trials yet to come, but Annie closed her eyes with a fragile hope blooming within her chest. She had come as a substitute, but something deeper was stirring now, something real, healing, and entirely her own. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and strangely comforting. Annie rose with the first blush of dawn, the air sharp against her cheeks as she moved through the kitchen with quiet purpose. The stove came alive under her hands, biscuits browning in the oven, coffee simmering strong and fragrant, bacon sizzling in the pan until its aroma filled every corner of the house. By the time Jessie entered from the barn, his boots heavy with dust, the table was already set. He would pause at the threshold, hat in hand, his grey eyes lingering on her as though surprised anew that someone had woven warmth into the cold frame of his solitary world. Their conversations remained sparse, yet the silences grew softer, no longer edged with distance, but lined with a tentative ease. He asked questions that mattered, not idle talk, about her skills with livestock, her knowledge of planting, her strength in the face of loneliness. Annie answered plainly, her voice steady, and with each exchange she felt something unfurl between them, fragile but alive, like a shoot breaking through stubborn soil. Jessie's approval came not through lavish words, but through the quiet curve of his mouth, the way his gaze softened when he thought she did not notice, the unspoken trust when he placed tasks in her care without hesitation. She worked tirelessly in those first weeks, not out of duty alone, but out of a yearning to belong. The house, once silent and stark, grew gentler under her touch. She scrubbed the parlour rug until the colours shone brighter, rearranged furniture so that the morning light poured across the room, coaxed life from the neglected garden where struggling tomato plants fought for survival. Every action was a prayer. Each small healing gesture whispered into the bones of the house and into Jessie's solitude. One afternoon, as the sun bent low and painted the fields in gold, a wagon rattled into the yard. A woman stepped down. Hattie Rose Fletcher, the nearest neighbour, her face lined with weather, but her eyes sharp and kind. She clasped Annie's hands with warmth, studying her as though she could read the whole story in the plainness of her dress, the steadiness of her gaze. Over coffee, Annie told her the truth, of Evelyn, of deception, of Jessie's uncertain silence. Hattie listened without interruption, then said simply, "Pretty lasts one season out here. Grit lasts a lifetime. I see grit in you, girl. That's what will keep this place alive." Those words settled into Annie like balm, healing wounds she hadn't dared acknowledge, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe she might be more than a substitute. That evening, when Jessie returned from mending fences, Annie was in the garden again, her hands dark with soil. He took the bucket from her without being asked, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment, and together they watered the fragile plants. The silence was companionable, threaded with something unspoken that pulsed like a current beneath the ordinary. "Jonah asked if he might come to supper," Jessie said at last, his tone measured. Annie looked up, catching the flicker in his eyes, the unvoiced test behind the words. "Of course," she answered gently. Supper that night brimmed with Jonah's laughter and stories, his compliments directed at Annie with disarming ease. He admired her cooking, her way of arranging wildflowers on the table, the simple grace she carried in every movement. Jessie spoke little, his eyes moving between Jonah's eager warmth and Annie's quiet steadiness. When Jonah finally left, tipping his hat and grinning at Annie as though reluctant to part, the silence that followed was thick, heavy with what Jessie did not say. Annie washed the dishes, her hands steady in the warm water, until Jessie spoke, his voice low and rough. "He's young. He'd court you proper, give you the kind of life you might have wanted." Annie turned, meeting his gaze with all the strength she had carried since that first moment at the station. "I didn't come here to be courted, Jessie. I came because truth matters more than appearances. What happens now is not about what I might have wanted once, it's about what I choose today." His eyes held hers, searching, grey depths shadowed with storms, yet lit with something fragile and bright. "And what do you choose?" he asked, the question unspoken in his tone, though not in his words. Annie swallowed, her heart steady even as it pounded within her chest. "I choose to stay, unless you send me away." The weight of her words settled between them, a delicate, trembling truth. Jessie's jaw tightened, his gaze unreadable. But in that silence, something shifted. Not a decision yet, but a recognition, a possibility taking root. Later, as Annie lay in her narrow bed, she listened to the coyotes call across the hills, her heart both heavy and light. The path ahead remained uncertain, but within that uncertainty lived a new warmth, a healing spark she had never known before, and as she drifted into sleep, she felt not like a shadow, not like a substitute, but a woman standing on the threshold of her own destiny, ready to step fully into the life waiting for her. The following morning carried the scent of dew and wood smoke, the kind of air that made every breath feel like a cleansing prayer. Annie rose before the sun, her body already moving in rhythm with the land, as though the earth itself had begun to teach her its secrets. She baked bread, swept the lingering dust from the floorboards, and carried fresh water to the wash basin before Jesse's boots even crossed the porch. When he entered, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes, he paused again at the threshold, his gaze resting on the sight of her moving quietly through the kitchen. Something softened in his expression, though he said nothing, only removed his hat and sat at the table as if the silence between them was already becoming a language they both understood. Over breakfast, his questions carried more weight than before, each one pressed like a stone into the foundation they were building. Could she endure isolation when winter sealed the valley with snow for weeks on end? Did she know how to birth calves or handle a frightened mare when storms split the sky? Annie's answers were plain, spoken without hesitation, her voice carrying the conviction of a woman who had long labored unseen but never faltered. "I've lived with loneliness," she said softly. "Not the kind the land gives, but the kind of being overlooked in a room full of people. I know what it means to stand alone, and I know what it means to keep going." For the first time, his eyes held hers longer than a moment, and there was something in his gaze like respect, quiet, tentative, yet real. By mid-morning, he led her outside, showing her the breadth of his world. The ranch stretched in every direction, fences marking lines of labor and hope, corrals alive with restless horses, chickens pecking near the barn, and the mountains standing tall and eternal beyond it all. "Every post here, every board, I placed myself," Jesse said, his voice low and threaded with memory. "The war left me with nothing, so I built this, with these hands, scarred as they are." Annie listened, her heart tightening with something she could not yet name. She did not see a man hardened by loss, but one who had carved life from desolation, who had given everything of himself to the land. "Then it's not just yours," she answered softly. "It's you." His grey eyes flicked toward her, sharp as if the truth of her words struck deep. The sun climbed higher, and with it came a rider cutting across the fields, Jonah Cooper, his youthful energy spilling over like spring water. He tipped his hat with a smile bright enough to stir heat in Annie's cheeks, his gaze lingering in ways she had never grown used to. He praised her cooking again, admired her work in the garden, offered his help with a warmth that was both flattering and unsettling. Annie's heart fluttered at being seen, but her gaze drifted to Jessie, whose silence weighed heavier than Jonah's words. When Jonah laughed too long at some small jest, Jessie's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his hands restless at his sides, as though he held back words he refused to give voice to. Later, when Jonah had ridden off, Annie returned to her work inside, her hands busy with mending, her thoughts a restless tide. The house no longer felt barren. Every chair dusted, every window brightened, every corner touched by her presence, until warmth began to seep into its bones. Jessie entered near sunset, finding her at the hearth, coaxing the fire into life. He stood there for a long moment, watching her, until she finally looked up and caught the unguarded truth in his gaze. It was not desire yet, nor love declared, but a recognition, the dawning awareness of what her presence had changed. That evening, As they shared a meal in quiet harmony, the unspoken hovered between them like the glow of lamplight, gentle but insistent. When she washed the dishes, he dried them without a word, his hands steady beside hers. At last, he set a plate aside and turned toward her, his face shadowed yet open. "This house," he said quietly, "feels alive with you in it. One day, and it's different. I don't know what that means yet, but I know I don't want to lose it." Annie's breath caught, the words sinking into her like water into thirsty soil. She did not speak, for words felt too fragile, but her silence carried her answer, steady and sure. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Annie listened to the wind sweep across the open land. The coyotes called in the distance, the timbers of the house creaked in familiar rhythm, and for the first time she felt no ache of displacement. She belonged, not because she had been sent, not because she filled another's place, but because something had begun to root between her and Jessie, a truth deeper than appearances. Tomorrow would test them again, as the land always did. But Annie closed her eyes with a quiet strength blooming in her chest. The healing she had long sought was no longer a dream. It was unfolding here, in the silence, in the soil, in the unspoken promise that maybe, just maybe, she was finally home. The first hint of dawn painted the sky in shades of pale rose when Annie stirred awake, the air cool against her cheeks, the unfamiliar yet comforting creak of the house reminding her again where she was. For a fleeting heartbeat, she forgot the burden that had brought her here, the lies spun by her sister, the command of her father, and felt only the promise of this new day, fragile but steady. She rose quickly, dressing in her brown calico, her fingers smoothing the fabric with unusual care, as though presentation might matter now in ways it never had before. The simple act of pinning her hair became almost ceremonial, each motion a whispered vow of courage. In the kitchen, light filtered gently through the small windows, touching every surface with warmth. Annie moved with a grace, born of habit and resilience, setting biscuits in the oven, cracking eggs into the pan, coaxing a fire to full life. The scent of coffee rose rich and grounding, filling the space with a comfort Jessie had not known for years. She felt the rhythm of the house changing beneath her hands, as though it too was stirring awake to her presence. By the time Jessie entered from the barn, dust on his boots and cool air clinging to his clothes, the table was alive with food. He paused on the threshold, the door creaking behind him, and simply stood there watching her, his grey eyes unreadable but softened by something that shimmered just beyond words. They ate quietly, yet the silence no longer pressed heavy. Jessie's gaze lingered often, thoughtful, as if weighing not her plain face or worn dress, but the way her presence filled the emptiness he had long carried. "You didn't have to," he said at last, nodding toward the meal. Annie kept her voice soft, warm. "I'm used to being useful. It brings me peace." His lips pressed into something that almost resembled a smile, a shadow of gratitude breaking through his guardedness. After breakfast, he led her outside. The land stretched endlessly, kissed by morning light, the peaks of the mountains still capped in snow, even as the valley woke with promise. Jessie pointed to the corrals, to the fields, to the fences stretching across the distance, his voice low but steady. 200 acres, every fence post dug with these hands, every beam set after the war, when I had nothing but will." His scarred fingers flexed unconsciously as he spoke, as though the memory of labor still lived in them. Annie's chest tightened at the quiet confession, and she whispered, "It's more than land, Jessie. It's your soul laid into the earth." His eyes flicked to hers, sharp, startled by the truth she had spoken, and for a moment he said nothing, only held her gaze until the silence itself became an answer. Their walk was interrupted by the thunder of hooves. Jonah Cooper appeared, riding fast, his sandy hair catching the sun. He dismounted with easy charm, his smile broad and warm as he tipped his hat. "Morning, Miss Annie," he said, his eyes lingering in open admiration. Heat rushed to her cheeks, unaccustomed as she was to being regarded with such obvious interest. Jessie's face remained unreadable, though his posture stiffened, his grey eyes narrowing with something he did not speak. Jonah spoke freely, praising her cooking from the night before, teasing Jessie lightly and offering to lend a hand around the ranch. His presence was youthful, lively, filling the space with brightness. But Annie noticed how Jessie's silence deepened in contrast, the air taut between them. Later, when Jonah had ridden away, Jessie turned to her, his jaw tight. "He's a good man," he said quietly. "Young, strong. He'd court you properly, give you something easier than this." Annie held his gaze, her own steady despite the tremor inside. "I didn't come for ease. I came because truth matters more than comfort." Her words hung in the air, carried away on the wind, but sinking into Jessie's silence like water into soil parched by years of drought. He looked at her for a long moment, then turned away, but the tension in his shoulders had shifted, not softened, not yet, but changed. The rest of the day passed in work. Annie scrubbed the parlour until the rug gleamed, rearranged the furniture to catch the light, and set beans soaking for supper. She aired Jessie's room, discovering its stark emptiness, the bed made with military precision, a single Bible resting on the nightstand. She touched nothing more than she needed to, but the sight of the uniform folded carefully in his trunk lingered in her mind, a reminder of the weight he carried. She brought order where there had been solitude, warmth where there had been silence, every small act breathing life into spaces that had long forgotten tenderness. As the sun lowered, Annie stood in the garden, sleeves rolled, hands dark with soil, coaxing stubborn plants into renewed life. Jessie appeared at her side, taking the bucket from her without a word, their hands brushing for a fleeting instant. Together, they watered the fragile shoots. The silence between them was no longer strained, but companionable, threaded with something unspoken that pulsed with quiet strength. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, hesitant. "This place feels different with you in it." Annie's breath caught, but she answered only with a soft nod, her hands steady on the watering can. That evening, the air hummed with a fragile peace. Jonah joined them for supper again, filling the table with laughter and easy words, his eyes lingering often on Annie. Jessie grew quieter with every moment, his grey gaze shadowed with thought. When Jonah finally left, the silence that followed was heavy, thick with what Jessie could not yet bring himself to say. Annie washed the dishes, Jessie dried them, their movements a quiet rhythm of togetherness. At last he set down the towel, his voice roughened by the weight of the truth pressing within him. "I haven't decided anything," he said, "except that this house feels alive with you here. Different, whole. Annie felt the words settle deep in her chest, filling places long starved of warmth. She did not answer with speech, for words would have been too fragile, but the way her eyes held his, the way her hands moved with steady grace, carried her reply. That night, lying in her narrow bed, listening to the coyotes call across the valley, she closed her eyes and let his words echo within her like a healing prayer. She had been sent as a substitute, but here, now, she felt something deeper beginning to root. A possibility that she was chosen not by accident, but by truth. The wind rattled the shutters, steady and strong, and Annie let it soothe her into sleep, carrying with it the fragile promise of a love that was waiting to bloom. The afternoon sun stretched long golden fingers across the valley, gilding the fences and painting the sky with the soft haze of early autumn. Annie stood in the garden with her skirts gathered, brushing dirt from her hands as she inspected the small rows of vegetables she had coaxed back to life. The leaves trembled faintly in the breeze, and though the soil remained stubborn, she felt a quiet pride stir within her. Life, even in its most fragile form, could rise from neglect with patience, care, and devotion. She looked up as Jesse approached, his stride purposeful, his shirt clinging with sweat from hours of labor. He paused at the sight of her bent over the earth, and for the first time his expression softened into something unguarded, as though he saw not just her hands in the dirt, but the heart steady enough to nurture what he had nearly abandoned. Together they carried water, their shoulders brushing when their arms crossed, a wordless rhythm forming between them. He gave no instructions, no criticism, only followed her lead as she tended the plants. When the last bucket had been poured, the two of them stood in the fading light, watching the sky bleed into shades of rose and violet. Jesse's voice, when it came, was low and almost rough. Jonah asked if he might come again tonight. Annie turned, catching the glint in his eyes that revealed more than the simple question. She inclined her head gently. "Then let him come. There will be enough." The words carried no fear, no jealousy, only quiet steadiness, though in her chest her heart ached with a weight she could not name. That evening, Jonah arrived with a grin that lit the dim room brighter than the lantern on the table. He brought laughter, stories of his youth, his admiration of Annie's cooking spilling too freely across the meal. He spoke of her bread, of the flowers she had arranged, of the warmth her presence seemed to pour into the house. Annie listened politely, her cheeks warming with each compliment. But her gaze strayed often to Jesse, who sat quieter and quieter, his grey eyes unreadable, his jaw set in stern silence. He spoke little, yet his attention never left her, as though he measured every glance Jonah gave, every smile Annie returned, every ripple of ease that Jonah's youth brought into the room. When Jonah at last rose to leave, his hat tipping low and his smile lingering far too long on Annie's face, Jesse's hand closed the door with deliberate finality. The silence afterward was thick, broken only by the soft clatter of dishes. Annie turned to the basin, sleeves rolled, her hands steady in the water, though her heart beat with a quiet storm. Jesse dried the plates without a word, his movements clipped, his presence heavy beside her. At last he spoke, his voice rawer than she had yet heard. "He's a good man," he said, not looking at her. "Strong, honest. He'd court you proper. Give you youth, laughter, Something lighter than this. Annie's hand stilled, but she did not look away. "Do you think that is what I came for?" she asked quietly. Jesse set the plate aside, his eyes meeting hers at last, storm-grey and searching. "Then what did you come for?" Her voice was steady, though inside her soul trembled with the weight of the truth. "I came because I was sent, yes, but I stayed because truth matters more than lies. Because I wanted you to choose, not be deceived. And now I remain because something here feels like the life I was always meant to claim. Not because of ease or youth or laughter, but because it is real." The silence that followed stretched like a taut thread, fragile and dangerous, yet thrumming with something alive. Jesse's jaw worked, his gaze fierce upon her, until at last he said, "And what if I can't give you what you deserve? What if all I have are scars, silence, and work that never ends?" Annie turned fully then, her hands wet, her voice low, but carrying healing like a balm. "Then give me that. Give me yourself, as you are. I have never asked for more." For a long moment neither moved. Then Jesse reached, not bold, not certain, but with the careful touch of a man afraid of breaking what he sought to hold. His fingers brushed her damp hand, rough against her skin, and lingered there, the smallest act yet vast in its meaning. Annie's breath caught, but she did not pull away. In that fragile touch was more truth than Jonah's words, more promise than Evelyn's empty beauty, more healing than any dream she had once thought love to be. Jesse's hand tightened slightly, steadying, anchoring, choosing. They finished the chores in silence, but it was no longer a silence heavy with unspoken doubts. It was a silence humming with possibility, the kind of quiet that held more than words ever could. That night, when Annie lay in the narrow guest bed, she touched her hand to the place where his had lingered, the warmth still present as though it had sunk beneath her skin. Outside, the Wyoming wind swept across the valley, fierce and unbroken, yet to Annie it sounded almost like a lullaby. She closed her eyes with a steady calm in her heart, a healing certainty blooming at last. She was no longer here as a substitute, no longer bound by the shadow of her sister's face. She was Annie, chosen in truth, standing at the beginning of a love that might yet endure every storm. The storm came 3 nights later, sudden and furious, as if the heavens themselves wished to test the fragile bond that had only just begun to take root between Annie and Jesse. Thunder rolled like cannon fire across the valley, shaking the walls of the ranch house. Rain lashed the windows, rattling the panes so violently Annie feared they might shatter. From her bed she heard the frantic lowing of cattle, the desperate pounding of hooves. She threw on her dress, the fabric clinging damply against her skin, and hurried down the stairs. Through the open door she caught sight of Jesse, already astride a horse, his slicker whipping wildly in the wind, determination etched into every line of his face. Jonah had come too, his smaller figure barely visible in the sheets of rain, his voice carried away by the tempest. "Stay inside!" Jesse shouted, his voice rough, commanding. But Annie did not retreat. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders, teeth clenched against the storm's fury, and plunged into the night. Mud sucked at her boots, the water nearly knocking her off her feet as she stumbled toward the corral. Lightning split the sky, illuminating Jesse waist-deep in the swollen creek. wrestling against the current for a calf pinned against a fallen log. Annie's heart lurched with fear so sharp it stole her breath, but she did not falter. She slid down the muddy bank, grabbing onto a sturdy root with one hand as she stretched the other toward him. "Together!" she cried, her voice breaking through the roar. For a single heartbeat, Jessie's eyes met hers, fierce and burning even in the storm. He wanted to send her back, to command her to safety, but something in her defiance, in her refusal to abandon him, broke through the iron walls he had built around his soul. With a sharp nod, he grasped her wrist, and together they heaved against the raging water. The calf broke free, stumbling to the bank, but the current dragged Jessie under. Annie's scream split the night as she lunged forward, her hands clutching desperately at his shirt. Jonah appeared then, his strength joining hers, and together they hauled Jessie onto the muddy shore, gasping, soaked, and alive. Back at the house, the fire crackled fiercely against the damp as Annie stripped off her sodden shawl and pressed steaming coffee into Jessie's trembling hands. His face was pale, his grey eyes darkened not by exhaustion, but by the weight of what had almost been lost. He studied her, the storm's echoes still roaring in his chest, and spoke hoarsely. "You could have been killed!" Annie's hands shook as she poured another cup, but her voice was steady. "So could you. Did you think I'd just stand and watch?" His lips parted, but no words came. Instead, he reached for her hand, calloused fingers rough, yet achingly gentle. "You're not like most women," he murmured. Annie lifted her chin, her voice quiet but firm. "No, and I don't want to be." The silence that followed was not the silence of distance, but of something blooming, tender and fragile, yet strong enough to weather even the fiercest storm. Jessie's grip tightened around her hand, his eyes softening into something she had never seen before, something that both terrified and healed her in the same breath. She realized then that love did not announce itself with fanfare or perfection. It was found in the storm-soaked moments, in the desperate clutch of survival, in the steady warmth of a hand refusing to let go. 2 days later, when the sun returned and the valley shone clean and new beneath its golden light, Jessie stood on the porch beside her. His arm brushed hers, not by accident but by choice, his presence solid and unyielding. "I spoke to the preacher," he said simply, his voice stripped bare of all pretense. "If you'll have me, we can be married on Saturday. Nothing fancy, just the truth, binding and permanent." Annie's throat tightened, her heart racing not with fear, but with a deep, healing certainty. She turned to him, meeting his steady gaze, and whispered, "I don't need fancy. I just need you." The world seemed to still, the mountains themselves bearing witness, as Jessie's lips curved into the faintest smile, a smile that spoke of storms endured, of battles yet to come, of a future built not on illusions, but on truth. Annie felt her chest swell with something she had never dared to claim before: belonging. She was no longer the plain sister, no longer second best, no longer living in Evelyn's shadow. She was Annie, chosen and cherished, standing at the threshold of a life that was hers alone. And as their story unfolded, one born not of perfection, but of honesty, not of ease, but of endurance, it carried within it a truth that reached beyond the walls of their home. Love is not found in grand gestures or flawless beauty, but in the daily choice to stand beside one another, to face the storms together, and to see each other fully for who they are. If this tale has touched your heart, if Annie's journey has stirred even a whisper of hope or healing within you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what moments lingered with you, what truths resonated in your soul. And if you wish to walk beside us in more stories of resilience, love, and the quiet power of choosing truth over illusion, please like this story, subscribe for more, and add your voice to this circle of hearts seeking light in the dark. Every word you offer, every gesture of support, is a seed of healing that helps these stories grow and continue, just as Annie and Jessie's love has grown, weathering storms into forever.